our session is really devoted to European settlement and land use. I'm going to be introducing the two speakers at the same time, and then allow them to come up and speak. And afterwards, we'll have a question and answer period after they're finished. Today, as our first speaker, we have Miranda Leibel. She was planning on co-presenting today with Dr. Amy Mack, who was unfortunately not able to be here. But Dr. Leibel is an assistant professor and the Evelyn Hamilton Chair in Liberal Education at the University of Lethbridge. Her current research explores the connections between bureaucracy, public administration, and power in the context of settler colonial Canada, both historically and in the present. Her most recent publications include the 2021 article that appears in the Journal of Canadian Studies, which examines recent discourse of accountability in Alberta in respect to child intervention practices, and the 2024 article in the Parliamentary Affairs examining the government Hansard record as one of process and ways that in which its editorial decisions and textual publication helps strip it of its speech, emotionality, and effect. And I take it that really what we're talking about is stripping speakers of their humanity. Dr. Leibel will present today for the purposes of the Dominion, land administration, and settler sovereignty in the Prairie. And following her is Carol Kehoe, a third-year history student at the University of Calgary in Alberta. That was in my notes. Prior to returning to academic studies, Carol worked as an environmental engineer involved in site reclamation and environmental management of industrial sites. It's been a pleasure for me to get to know Carol, as my colleagues have in the Department of History. As a trained and experienced engineer, Carol has been bringing a keen and critical eye to the history of infrastructure, urbanization, and issues in environmental justice, most locally and especially here in Calgary. Carol's presentation is entitled "The Lower Nose Creek Valley, Crosscurrent to Calgary Ideals." With that, I would like you to welcome our first speaker today, Dr. Leibel.
As mentioned, Dr. Amy Mack, my good friend and colleague, was supposed to be here to present with me. Unfortunately, it's just me today, but I have some notes from Amy, and I'll try to do my best to do justice to her work, because this really is the start of a collaborative project between the two of us, really thinking about intersections that have come up between the different questions that we are interested in asking. And so, as a way of introduction, again, thank you to the organizers, thank you to all the staff and volunteers who've made this event possible. Thank you to all the other speakers. I feel really well positioned to take some of these conversations on, since we talked about the state and nation and sovereignty in the morning, and then we also talked about land use, landscape, the ways we understand cultural space. So I feel like I'm also coming into these conversations with a more rich and interdisciplinary understanding of some of the things we've started thinking about together. And it does feel particularly important with regards to a plenary on land use and European settlement to situate myself, especially starting with land and place. So I am a settler scholar. I was born and raised in Edmonton, known as Amiskwaciy-Waskagan and Cree, Treaty 6 territory. And I spent most of my life living there. My paternal ancestors came to the Prairie region of Canada from the Black Sea region of the Russian Empire in the early 20th century. And my maternal ancestors migrated to Edmonton from northern Italy after the end of the Second World War. And I've spent most of my life living in Treaty 6 territory until I moved to Ottawa, unceded Algonquin territory, to complete my PhD at Carleton. And then within 5 years, I was back in Alberta, and this is important because I do really love the prairies. I love Alberta. I love this place. And now I'm living in Treaty 7, Blackfoot Confederacy territory in Secaucetoke, also known as Lethbridge. And I name these relationships because land is not only central to this conversation this afternoon, but is in fact very central to how I think about my work. It's precisely because I've lived and related to different lands and places that my research has come to the place that it's in now. So I often say I used to think Western alienation was fake, and then I was an Albertan who lived in Ottawa for 5 years. It took me 2 months before I bought a pair of cowboy boots. And so it is really these relationships that drive me to think about what it is that I think about. And I do want to acknowledge also Dr. Amy Mack, whose work explores how historical processes that we're talking about today help us make sense of contemporary feelings of alienation and anger amongst Albertans. So Amy's work really is contemporary ethnographic work with folks who work primarily ranchers, but also many rural Albertan communities, dealing with the many contexts that we live in politically right now. And so I do need to get off my chest before I get too deep into the presentation that I'm not actually a historian. I'm not trained as a historian. I'm trained first as a political scientist and then as an interdisciplinary researcher in Canadian studies and political economy. But my work does begin with the assumption that political history is essential to any study of contemporary political issues. We can't understand anything that happened in the present without understanding the things that have made it that way. And I think that the way the political world looks right now it's really important to not think of it as sort of a natural state of affairs. This is not the obvious outcome. It was always not destined to look this way. Alberta politics were not destined to look the way that they do, but very specific things made that happen. And we live in times where political sentiments of Western alienation, especially Alberta exceptionalism, are very prominent, often attached to very right-wing ideologies and policies. Right now, we're watching the circulation of the Alberta Prosperity Project and its starting point of so-called inalienable individual rights. And if we want to think about this contemporary reality, we also have to think about all the different pieces of history that are stuck underneath and sort of cobbled together to make this possible. And obviously, we can't do that in 20 minutes, but I'm going to start with a few things to help talk about how I'm thinking through these things and the conversations that Dr. Amy Mack and I are having in trying to bridge our work together. So very quickly, a few of the key components we're thinking through right now: political liberalism, sort of the foundational consensus of contemporary Canadian politics through the 19th, 20th, 21st century, emphasis on private property, this idea that private property becomes property through quote-unquote an improvement. Improvement here is in quotation marks because it's a very specific kind of improvement that's being conceptualized, namely exploitation of the land to create profit, and that's important. And individual liberties, the right to be protected from intrusions. And of course, there's different varieties of liberalism, but I'm drawing here on Elena Choquette's work on Canadian liberalism specifically, which she calls colonial liberalism, which leads me into the next point, to conceptualize settler colonialism, which we've had a lot of conversations around today already, and in a very general way. Settler colonialism refers to colonial expansion, which settler societies, settler governance structures, laws, economies were intended to supplant and replace existing Indigenous societies, laws, cultures, economies. And so it's important because the ideology that was brought to Canada was imposed upon Indigenous lands, and I use the image of the CPR land grants very specifically here. It was quite literally imposed on Indigenous lands, this ideological view of property that could be individually parceled out, turned into productive land for settlement, and generating agricultural profit. And that's where I get to this concept of land imaginaries. I'm borrowing the term from Sarah Ruth Sipple, a human geographer, who talks about how land imaginaries refer to the underlying understandings, views, and visions of what land is, can, and should be. And so what I'm trying to convey in my historical analysis is that the Dominion of Canada actually had a very clear answer to those questions. So if we're imagining the questions of land imaginaries to be, what is land? What can land be? What should it be? The Dominion Lands Act has some pretty clear ideas about what it is, can, and should be in terms of improvement. And this, again, is thinking through the lens of profit. And then Dominion Lands policies. These were the response in terms of creating the responses to these questions. So adopted 1871, the Dominion Land Survey, which used technical and scientific to produce knowledge of the land with the intention of being used to justify dispossession. And this was especially true in terms of the transformation of communal lands, especially Métis, but also communities like the Doukhobors across the prairies, communal lands into private property regimes. And especially, again, as we see in the kinds of maps that most of us from the prairies will be very accustomed to, through these very clear, demarcated, boundaried, sort of patchwork quilt systems. And then we also have the Dominion Lands Act, 1872, received royal assent, and this was the product of the purchase of the Northwest Territories, formerly Rupert's Land, from the Hudson's Bay Company. It drew on American homestead legislation, and the Dominion government created the Dominion Lands Act in 1872 to provide the legal authority under which the Crown could grant lands to individuals, but also, and this is important, to corporations. Also to railway construction, municipalities, and religious groups. It received a few amendments over the years, so I'm not going to go into all the specifics of the different ways that it parceled out land. Sometimes certain individuals were more empowered to have land, so this is especially the case of white settler women who were sometimes more likely to be offered land for sale and sometimes restricted. A key focus, again, was also groups like the Doukhobors who lived communally and whether or not that made them appropriate settlers for the prairies. So if you look in the records of the House of Commons debates, you'll see that there are actually quite a few debates whether or not the Doukhobors are quote-unquote appropriate or suitable settlers for the prairies. On the one hand, they have the skills and experience to facilitate agricultural resource development in similar climates. And on the other hand, they don't answer the questions of what land is, can, and should be in the same way. This is broadly the historical context of the policies we're looking at, and some of the things that I'm really interested in and that I bring to the conversation with Dr. Amy Mack are that when you look into the archival histories, there's a lot of contestation happening. And one of the things that I think is really valuable to think about are the ways that settlers actually did not unanimously agree with the idea of the Dominion Land Survey and the ways that lands were allocated. There's quite a rich, and this is something I need to do more looking into, but there's quite a rich history of especially Métis and settler solidarity around land rights and around the discussion of who's going to decide how land gets separated, surveyed, and allocated. So especially leading up to 1885, the Alberta Settlers' Rights organizations were in fact writing to John A. Macdonald and saying they're going to join the resistance if some of these grievances related to Western alienation are not dealt with. And then, of course, the one that maybe folks are more commonly used to hearing is this aspect of the Dominion Lands Act, which maintained provincial public lands under Dominion control. So most other provinces did have access to their public lands and resources. Alberta and Saskatchewan did not have these abilities even after becoming provinces in 1905, and regained these rights, so to speak, in 1932. And what I'm really trying to think about here is the tension between, property, whiteness, Western alienation that's coming together in these historical examples. And I want to use history as sort of an anchor point. It's not an excuse or a legitimation of the ways that white settlers have dispossessed, but rather as the possibility of rethinking how the relationship between folks in prairie provinces and the federal government, but also prairie settlers, prairie Indigenous peoples, prairie newcomers can think about relationality. And here I'm working with Amy's notes, so give me a little patience because it's not my own work now. Dr. Amy Mack works on Western alienation, and she's written here for me that in her work, Western alienation is tied to feelings of entitlement, and she refers to this specifically as aggrieved entitlement. And here she's referring to the ways that her interlocutors, so those she interviews, ranchers, rural Albertan communities, draw on their own familial or cultural history of settlers, pioneers, founders in the region as a justification for why Albertans should have self-determination sovereignty in the region. And the emphasis on building and settling the prairies ignores the many Indigenous groups who have called this land home since time immemorial, and erases women, people of color who have also been foundational in the history. And this leaves us with a very white and male-coded version of what it means to be a prairie person. This version of Western alienation is also rooted in resource extraction, which further entrenches a sense of rugged individualism, often coded with rugged masculinity, to this experience, and builds on historic battles with Ottawa and central Canada. It also helps understand resistance to carbon tax, proposed coal mining, and we'll turn to this in a moment, but also resistance to proposed coal mining on the part of some communities who are typically more conservative, but have important relationships with the watersheds in the region. And both instances, the interlocutors draw on the stereotype of hardworking, working class men as builders of this province and nation, which justifies then ongoing resource extraction, as well as resistance to the concept of land back or any sort of rethinking of rights and land use, which is a conversation that we were having this morning, thinking about Blackfoot rights to accessing traditional sites. And so one of the questions now that we're sort of, as we're bringing all this together, the question that we are thinking about is what possibilities exist for a different prairie relationality. And so here, a couple of things we're thinking about. First, that things are not unprecedented. We keep hearing everything's unprecedented. In fact, things are very precedented. Second are that the ways that things are, the fact that they are precedented in the ways they are, required a lot of effort to form, sustain, often violence to form and sustain. And that means that effort can be redirected to alternatives. There's different ways that we can live and ground ourselves in these lands, and different forms of relationality that can happen. So many ranchers, farmers, and settlers do have deep attachments to these lands, and often are grounded in love of these lands. And that doesn't mean that the sense of entitlement is also not problematic, not grounded in dispossession of Indigenous peoples. And so one of the examples is that many of the interlocutors that Dr. Amy Mack works with are really in opposition to the proposed coal mining on the eastern slopes. And that seems kind of at odds with each other until you realize that, well, that's going to destroy a lot of the land that ranchers use to sustain their grazing pastures, that makes it really difficult for them to do the kinds of things they've come to value in these lands. So thinking about different examples, of ways people have related to land. Trevor Harrison has a great book, Towards Prairie Atonement, talking about community pastures in the 1930s coming out of the Depression and the drought years, talking about how communal land pastures were an alternative. And this isn't a utopian or idealistic romantic notion of history. It was actually quite problematic to create these community pastures. Communities were dispossessed. Specifically, Trevor Harrison writes about the Métis community of St. Madeleine and how it was eviscerated to create Spy Hill Elise under the Farm Rehabilitation Act. So none of this is to say that this is easy. A different prairie relationality is not, sort of obvious, easy, or utopian by any means. But I want to reemphasize that the point we're trying to make is that political history is essential in understanding contemporary politics, and that land understood through the land imaginaries I talked about, so especially private property, ideas of what it means to improve land, turned us into a society grounded around certain ideals of land use, land management, and therefore relationships to land. And that means that we can answer those questions differently. Resource economies are a foundational myth of the settled West, and engaging in questions of rethinking prairie relationality also depends on disentangling land and property and reconceptualizing not only how we relate to the land, how we relate to each other, and also how we relate to the land. So I'm not making any claims necessarily about how this is or is not instructive for an obvious path forward, but instead I want to emphasize that the history is complex, it's not utopic. I don't want the takeaway from this conversation to be like, let's go look at the Farm Rehabilitation Act of 1935. It'll be perfectly instructive for how to rebuild communities. That's not the case. But what I do think that Amy and I, when we were talking about this presentation, what we do really want to emphasize as the takeaway is that there are threads of political histories that teach us that it took a lot of work to make the world look the way that it does. And that means that there's nothing natural about this arrangement. There's nothing obvious or inherent about this arrangement. And that also means that we could make different political worlds too. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Lower Nose Creek Valley, Crosscurrent to Calgary Ideals. So buckle up, going to cover 150 years in 20 minutes. So here we go. First, thank you all for giving your Saturday afternoon to us. Much appreciated. So for those unfamiliar, this is the Lower Nose Creek Valley. You may know it as Bottomlands Park, the Wilder Zoo, the Science Center. You may also know it as Deerfoot Trail Raceway and Memorial Drive and the LRT. So here we are today at the Confluence, which was known as Fort Calgary. But I'm going to take you downriver to the Nose Creek, which is another confluence, the confluence of the Nose Creek to the Bow River. Of course, the Lower Nose Creek Valley existed long before Calgary or the Confluence did. And despite significant changes in land use and major earthworks projects throughout the valley, the past has not been completely erased by machines here. Archaeological studies have found a bison kill site and a separate campsite. When settlers arrived in the mid-1800s, there was already a well-worn path, which was called the Trail to Blackfoot Crossing. Of course, we named it Blackfoot Trail, and then we thought, well, that's too much of a connection, so now it's Memorial Drive. And when the Dominion land surveyors came out, there was already people there too. Some of the early settlers were there. So when the Canadian Pacific Railway arrived in 1883, there was already a rather diverse group of people hanging out here. And there was also the There was the Northwest Mounted Police, of course. There were retired Northwest Mounted Police that were making their home in Calgary. There were many, many Métis, and there were a few migrants from East Canada, United States, and Europe. So here we have in the little circle there is someone I almost consider a friend, is Cuthbert McGillis, who was a Métis freighter at the time. And he had a cabin at the mouth of the Nose Creek, not far from the trail to Blackfoot Crossing. Now, unfortunately for Mr. McGillis, Section 13 became Canadian Pacific Railway land, and goodbye. I think is what happened to him. I'm not sure. I would love to know more about him. And maybe I need to go to a different talk. What is the ideal of Calgary? It's a nice little engineering diagram here for you. The ideal of law and order, a growing city, a sanitary city, and a community. So really, I could run for mayor on this platform, right? Like this is current. I can do this. But I'm going to flip it around, and instead of being from Calgary, it's going to look at it from the point of view of Nose Creek. So the ideal of law and order, we heard this morning about Mr. Sam Steele. We didn't, if there was a talk about the Scouts of Alberta Force, I missed that one. But in 1885, when as the uprising for the Frog Lake Cree was taking place, Sam Steele was tasked with putting together a force to join and work to go to Treaty 6 and put down that uprising. So he got together a group of police and also rounded up about 100 men from the Calgary area. Now they were promised provisions, a horse and saddle, and some food and pay to go and help out the federal government. And 100 of them said, yes, that sounds like a good plan. I found an article from the Calgary Herald that celebrated these men who know how to ride a bronco and hold a gun and will soon know how to chase a Cree. So that was the story. So these were the men that participated in the last battle of the 1885 Northwest Resistance, now called the Battle of Steel Narrows. And there's a commemorative site for that in Saskatchewan. The men returned to Calgary in July of 1885, and they had marched through the Nose Creek Valley off to the Resistance, and they marched back through the Nose Creek Valley, crossed over to be celebrated here in Calgary. So the path to battle and the path to vigorous policing after that. Because in the ideal of law and order, the end of the Riel Rebellion and the Cree Resistance saw the settlers, which were predominantly British and Protestant, like my grandparents, demand law and order be enforced by the Northwest Mounted Police in Calgary. This was a time when the pass system was being introduced, as well as the residential schools. So these are just some news clippings from that time. So the next example of the power of law and order, there was a person here this morning that was asking about health, about public health. So the smallpox riot of 1892 is an example of the enforcement of law and order, and there is a connection to the Nose Creek Valley here. So during the Calgary smallpox outbreak in 1892, the press and the public blamed the Chinese for keeping the disease hidden and spreading it to others, which culminated ultimately in a mob riot. So social Darwinism was not limited to the Indigenous. It was rather selective, but broad. So what does this have to do with Nose Creek? Well, the Northwest Mounted Police, enforcing good law and order and a sanitary city, quarantined all those affected with smallpox in a small little abandoned cabin at the mouth of the Nose Creek on the other side of the river. Now, I had the opportunity to examine some of the records as to who had who had got smallpox and were part of the quarantine crowd. So there was several Chinese men, But there was also a Mr. Keast, a Mr. Pettipies, a Burton family from Shepherd, and an English lady who had been pulled off the train on her way to New York because she was showing signs of smallpox. So despite the diversity of these people that had been forced into quarantine, the rioters focused their efforts on the Chinese community in Calgary. So moving on to a growing city, so Calgary grew from about 500 people in 1885 to over 44,000 people in 1911. That's a lot of people in a very short period of time, and was a time of massive capital investment because we basically had to make sewer, water, roads, schools, bridges, power, telephones. There's a lot that happened in that short period of time, but it started like that. So the horse was what drove growth, and the freighters were the ones that drove the horses, which goes back to my good friend Cuthbert McGillis in Nose Creek, who was one of those freighters, until the railway came. I don't know if anyone here has picked rocks. That's a lot of rocks. So there was the arrival of the train to Calgary in 1883, and then there was the construction of the Calgary-Edmonton Railway in the 1890s. And so suddenly, instead of taking 12 days to haul freight from Calgary to Edmonton, you could do it in 12 hours. So go fast or go home, right? And when they introduced a high-speed train, it was 5 hours. So that was 12 days, 12 hours, 5 hours. It meant the demise of the wide freight hauling business and required the transformation of the Nose Creek Valley into a railway corridor. Well, anyone from the prairies knows that when you have a railway and a stop, you get a town. So the intersection of Blackfoot Trail and the railway was well suited for the development of such a settlement. It was flat, it had fresh water, and it already had a road, so you didn't need to build that road. So here we have the Nose Creek Valley in the 1910s. It looks like any other rural town that you may have experienced at that same time period. We've got the bulk fuel agent, who turns out to be the only fuel dealer on the north side of the Bow River at this point in time. We've got the Golden West Brewery, what more do you want in town, which was only the second brewery in Calgary at the time, competing with Cross and the Golden Brewery and Malting in East Calgary. We also have several small houses and farms scattered in the valley here. So it looks like almost any small town that was on the prairies at this time, except that it was not, because this land, a lot of this land was still owned by CP Rail, so these were squatters or renters to the property, and because it wasn't really a town, it did not have the infrastructure that often came with small towns, as in there was no sewer and water, there was no municipal government per se, it was still on the fringe of the city, and so they had run and get it water and outhouses instead of a sewer system. It also had a grain elevator though, and it had a little restaurant. But when Nose Creek became incorporated into the Calgary town, the health department was really quick to shut down the restaurant, which had been run by two black women that had migrated to Canada from the States. But the brewery got to stay running. When it became part of Calgary, though, the city planners, and I respect city planners, they're trying to build cities. The intent was to turn Nose Creek into an industrial area. It was downstream of the water supply. It was downstream and out of the way from most people that lived in the city. So what a nice place to put an industrial park. So they bought some land, zoned some land, and the first thing they built was an incinerator. And the incinerator was going to provide steam power for other businesses that came into the area, because that's what the British were able to do, and that's what Calgary could do. And also, it was 1912, Calgary was booming, and what could possibly go wrong here? Now, I know you can't read this, and the point is, there's one little red circle there, and that little red circle was a person that was arrested in Nose Creek for running a body house in 1912. But if your only source of information was the newspapers, you would have thought that Nose Creek was a den of iniquity, and everything lawless and horrible in the world was happening in this little valley in those few houses that were there. That's the power of the press. But this is a list of arrest records that I got from the Calgary Police, thank you very much, in 1912, and it documents the arrest over a 3-day period. So there's one person from Nose Creek that got charged, but there's also people from various occupations, various parts of Calgary, some with no fixed address, originating from 8 different countries. So we had a very broad, wide representation of humanity, all in this one page. Likewise, in 1914, again, one arrest from Nose Creek in the record got a lot of ink coverage in the newspapers. So moving on to a sanitary city, as I hinted, Nose Creek had an incinerator back in the 1910s. Calgary aimed to be a clean and sanitary city from the very beginning. This was a real challenge. When you think about the means of transportation, we're horse and cart, and we had cattle drives through the city. You had piggeries in town, including in the lower Nose Creek Valley. But we wanted a clean and sanitary city, and the sanitation experts and the engineers said, you get that with incineration, because this was the progressive era, and we could destroy waste by burning it. So we embraced this technology. Turns out that waste destruction by incineration is really hard to do, and it's really unpleasant if you're burning manure. So that was not such a good idea. But we did persist, and Nose Creek was the location of the 3rd incinerator. But it was closed within a year, and in 1914 we scaled back to 1 incinerator. But as a sanitary city, we had sanitary inspectors that were kept busy on all manners of health issues. And the ideal of the sanitary city meant that smelly and messy businesses had to go somewhere, and many of those went to Nose Creek. So in the lower Nose Creek Valley, and some of you may be familiar with this, there was meat processing plants, a city slaughterhouse, as well as feedlots and piggeries. Even the old incinerator had been repurposed to be a meat processing plant. So in all of that, how do you get a community? Well, they did try. We have some beautiful pictures of people in Nose Creek on the left. There's the fellow that operated the brewery with his family out for a drive, it looks like. And we have these wonderful kids playing in the water. The only thing with that picture is it's actually from Elbow, because the Nose Creek River, the Nose Creek, as you can imagine by now, with piggeries and slaughterhouses and incinerators, was not the safest, healthiest bit of water to be playing in. Although kids did try, it was also a bit of a treacherous stream, and there was actually several drownings that happened over the years. So you can try to have a community, but you do need some basic resources to make it happen. I found this quite interesting, the idea of a community. As I said, a lot of the land was owned by CP Rail, and even in 1942, the land around the mouth of the Nose Creek was still owned by Nose Creek and leased. But that little shack at the mouth of Nose Creek that may have been McGillis's house was still in place in 42. But the drive for industrialization continued, and this application by landowners in 1957 was for the addition of more feedlots in the lower Nose Creek Valley. So in the post-World War II era, more and more of the sense of community was replaced with industrialization, as well as selecting this part of Calgary for not 1 but 2 waste disposal sites. But still, some homes remained along the Blackfoot Trail, and some more were added on the north end of the valley. But the ideal of community was slowly eroding away, And what had been the wonderful house of the brewmaster was, by the 1960s, part of a scrapyard. The industries, when they moved out of the valley, eventually the renters also moved out to make way for Deerfoot Trail and Memorial Drive. So the ideals of Calgary were possible in part because they did not fully extend to Nose Creek. The use of the valley for heavy industry was at the expense of the community, and the community was suspected and sometimes rightfully accused of being unlawful and disorderly, but likely no more than the rest of the city at the time that people were there. Calgary sought to be a sanitary city, which resulted in using Nose Creek as the place for quarantine, slaughterhouses, municipal waste management, and even while most of the community lacked basic sewer and water and things that you expect from an urban setting, I guess. So any evidence of past land use has now been removed. And we have instead a place for everyone, because you can go to the zoo or the park or the science center, ride the cycling trails, walk by the creek, but it's home to no one. So this is the Lower Nose Creek Valley. It's time to end, but I had the honor of seeing Shelley Nero's exhibit in Saskatoon this summer, and this is her comment on commemoration, which I thought was appropriate because there's no plaques up in Nose Creek for all these people.
Thank you, Carol. We have time now for questions.
This can be a question for both of you. But I noticed, like in both presentations, there was sort of like the use of the word settler was taken for granted. And in some of my research, I found that the word has experienced semantic drift since the 19th century. So I'm curious how you understand or would define the term each, like separately, or I don't know how to phrase that, but like, yeah, what does the word mean to you, and how do you use it today, and how does that relate to its historical usage?
Yeah, there's a lot of nuance and difficulty in using the term settler, and many academics have in fact gone on to have many debates about whether or not settler is appropriate, especially if groups are non-white, if they're refugee groups. And so when I use the term settler, I'm largely using it with regards to institutions. And so that way I was talking about it earlier on in terms of settler colonialism is this act of settler societies, economies, politics, governance structures supplanting Indigenous societies. The settlement is that act of supplanting. There's lots to tease out in terms of what constitutes the originary sort of settler moment of being supplanted versus contemporary Canadian nation state. Is that the same or different then? But those are some thoughts. Do you have anything to add?
I will add that I have no idea why I use that word, to be honest. That's the word I'm familiar with. My family emigrated and settled, and I will give it serious thought as to my choice of words, because I don't know enough about the complexity of that word.
I think it might be worth considering how the word has changed, because in the 19th century it often meant settled in a settlement, but it didn't mean non-Indigenous. And going to your point on support for Métis and First Nations rights by settlers associations, I'm curious, do you know what the composition of those associations was? Do you know if it was non-natives who made them up, or who the members were?
Yeah, so this is early stages of the research, but in fact, the settlers' rights groups were often white and significantly Métis involved in the settlers' rights groups, or European settlers with Métis families. And so there's no... also the use of the term settler here referring very specifically to settlers who were granted land under the Dominion Lands Act, under the homestead legislation. So that's also what's being referred to, which did sometimes include Métis, not always. And it would be really interesting to look in more to see how these different groups came about. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to get to the gentleman who had his hand up here with the leather jacket.
So, Carol and Miranda, thank you for your presentations. Appreciate it. So, Miranda, I'm just curious, any of your research into land, you know, there's two portions of the land. I'm an old oil patch guy. Surface rights and mineral rights. Has your research gotten into any of the mineral rights aspect? Because for me, it's pretty confusing. Hudson's Bay owned a bunch of mineral rights. The CNRL owned a bunch of, or CNRL, the railway owned a bunch of mineral rights. The Crown and the federal government and stuff. So I'm curious what you learned, or if you have gone into that. Thanks.
So thank you for the question. It's something I'm working on now, doing more work into. My understanding is that mineral rights were granted largely to the railway, Hudson's Bay, largely not to settlers. Often those were preserved by the Crown as mineral rights, but I don't know a lot about that, unfortunately.
It's only 1% of it.
Thank you.
This is really not too germane, but Sam Steele's wife, whom he married in 1890, his sweetheart, was from Quebec, but she was related to the McGillises. And she had a huge network of Métis ancestors and relatives, I should say, not her own ancestors, but relatives throughout the West. And one of Sam Steele's brothers also married a Métis woman. So it is, it's always been of interest to me how this might have affected Sam Steele's work. And he never mentions it in his autobiography or memoir, whatever we call it. So, but it's of interest to me. The McGillis connection.
Hi. Did you look at Hutterites, mineral rights?
We have not looked at Hutterite mineral rights at all yet. Yeah.
Please join me in thanking the speakers this afternoon.